Kelly O'Donnell of NBC News, and Neil King Jr. of the Wall Street Journal. And don't forget, you can watch as well as listen to the program by going to drshow.org and click on Watch Live. Otherwise, you can call us 800-433-8850. Send an email to drshow@wamu.org. Follow us on Facebook or send us a tweet. And happy Friday to all of you.
Happy Friday to you.
Good to see you. And Kelly O'Donnell, I'm going to start with you on this dash cam video and a new witness account. They've emerged in this Walter Scott shooting by South Carolina police officer. Do you think that that kind of evidence could really put that officer at risk for a charge of murder?
What is interesting about the dash cam video is it shows the ordinariness of how this all began. You see him wind through the initial stop. You see what appears to be a broken taillight, which was the probable cause. You see a very civil interaction between the officer and Walter Scott. There was some confusion about, did he own the car? Did he have insurance? Typical conversation that happens at the window. Nobody likes to be pulled over in a traffic stop. So you can understand how Walter Scott might have been nervous. He was speaking quickly. We couldn't hear everything, but the officer didn't seem hostile. Walter Scott didn't seem hostile. So what happened? So the officer retreats to his vehicle, the typical checking of the license or the car registration, what have you. And Mr. Scott gets out initially. He's told to get back in the car. He does initially. There's another person in the car. Then he bolts. That clearly raised the blood pressure for the officer. I mean, you can't get inside his head, but that would be a typical response for an officer to then give chase. Why? There have been times when traffic stops turned into an arrest of someone significant. I'm thinking of Tim McVeigh as an example, who was caught because of a traffic stop now 20 years after the Oklahoma City bombing. So you don't know what it is, but it seemed so ordinary. Now, the gap we don't have between that dash cam and the witness video is really the critical moment, because was there any physical touching between the officer and Scott? Was there a scuffle? That's the piece we don't have. And what we see with the officer is clearly he is firing several shots. That is what got him fired. That does not comport with the appropriate policy. But the initial stop seemed to be by the book.
Right, Helbing.
Absolutely a textbook stop, and seemed quite respectful. Nobody seems to be upset. Everything seems to be proceeding according to Hoyle. And then suddenly the door opens a second time, and it appears that Walter Scott gets out of the car quickly and just takes off. Just takes off running immediately. No word to the policeman, no kind of look around, just takes off running. Now, did he receive some sort of a message? Did he suddenly start thinking about the possibility of an outstanding warrant for child support? Did he, and this is something that had been part of his background, that's obviously not a fictional kind of a supposition, he suddenly decided he didn't want to have any further contact with this police officer, and maybe he was thinking that because this was not his car, and because it was not registered to him, that if he just sort of disappeared and got into somebody's yard and wasn't ever apprehended, maybe this would all kind of go away.
But you know what's hard for me to understand when you say there's this missing gap? We see the officer shoot from a distance, Neil, and there doesn't seem to be any contact because Walter Scott is already so far ahead. So why does the officer shoot?
I think that's the question. And it's interesting. The whole thing is almost exactly the opposite of Ferguson in many ways. From what we know of the Ferguson case, it started out immediately as a hostile encounter, both between, from the police officer to start and from Michael Brown, and then escalated from there. And from all we know, there was some sense that the officer had that he was endangered. In this case, it started out totally civilly in the most ordinary sort of way. The guy then begins to run, and instead of there being any kind of encounter or anything, he shoots him multiple times in the back while he's running away from him. I don't see how any of this, except for the witness video, is going to matter at all in terms of the difficulty of the police officer that he now faces for a murder charge, because it's just so blatant what it is that happened.
And there is now some background on the police officer himself.
Michael Slager had other encounters with people in the neighborhood. This is a racially mixed community. It's about evenly mixed between white and black, as opposed to Ferguson, which was 2-to-1 African American. And in this community, there had been some instances before where the police obviously had encounters with people. He detained a person on the street who was something along the lines of a foot taller than the person he was supposedly looking for. He was looking for a 5'5" suspect in a particular incident. And he detained a 6'3" young man and apparently tased him at some point in their scuffle. So that case is going to come back, and that person is now reemerging and testifying, I should say. He's talking on television about this officer and wanting to get his day in court. So we're going to hear a lot more about his past history. Apart from that, he hasn't been on the force terribly long, but he has been there for a little while, and he has an 8 months pregnant wife, and the department is going to continue his insurance for his baby.
And what do we know about the young man who captured the scene on video, Kelly?
This was his normal path to work. Works as a barber, noticed something, it caught his attention. His instinct was to get out his phone. What's really remarkable is how steady he was and how really fearless he was to approach even closer. He had to know, and did know at some point, that people were aware of his presence. It's not like he was hidden behind bushes. This wasn't surreptitious. He was there. Now, the officer may have been so focused on what was in front of him, he might not have known. But that was brave. He just met with the family of Walter Scott, and that was very emotional. The mother of Walter Scott, the man who died, was just overcome with emotion, because she believes that had not been that video taken, then there would be no case, there would be no conversation. What I think is interesting about the dash cam versus the witness video is what happens to this officer that an encounter that appears so normal could go so wrong. Because any of us who are in a car and might be stopped and you're having a pleasant interaction, what happened that would cause this to take place? There were no cues that I could detect. If I'm Walter Scott, from the officer, what happened that would cause him to make a judgment to use his weapon? That's, to me, what is so disturbing about the dash cam video.
And the other interesting incident is that the man holding the cell phone or camera who took the video went to the police headquarters, was told to wait, and then thought better of waiting and walked out.
Well, he has expressed in interviews to people starting from since yesterday that he was fearful all along, and he even had thought about whether he should himself delete this video, whether it would change his life in bad ways, whether it might even endanger his life, which it actually, it certainly has changed his life. The fact that he then took it public in the way he did was certainly the right way to go about it. One thing I just wanted to know, we talk about it was a routine traffic stop. The thing that's so insidious about these so-called routine traffic stops is that they're not really that routine, except for a certain number of people or a certain type of people. In South Carolina, the figures from last year was that 76% of all such routine traffic stops involved black drivers, and about half of all of them were black men, even though, of course, the percentage of the population that either of those groups would represent is infinitely smaller than that. So they're routine for a certain number of people, a certain group of people, and they turn in weird directions like this much more often also for that same group of people. And that's why this has struck such a nerve. It's what would seem to be a routine traffic stop ends up in the death of a man for no clear reason.
So now body cameras for all police officers there.
There was a grant made available, and they will use body cameras. Body cameras will be, like the dash cam, in the sense that it will capture whatever is happening. It'll have audio. It will be on the person of the officer, so we would see more of the interaction. And the presumption is, if everyone knows, every officer knows his or her conduct is being taped, that will cause them to behave in a way that is by the book.
But if you had just had a dash camera, you wouldn't have caught any of this.
No, but the dash cam is a start because there's protection there for the citizen and there's protection there for the officer. If the world knows more or less that there's a dash cam in every case, people are a little less likely to try to shoot their way out of a pullover, to shoot their way out of a traffic stop.
So we have learned some lessons from Ferguson. Short break here. Your calls, your comments when we come back. Stay with us. And following that shooting by a police officer of a civilian driver in South Carolina, we learned that the Ferguson area has had a brand new city council election. What happened, Ron?
Well, 2 more African-American members of the Ferguson committee were added to that city council. So now it's 3 and 3, and a 7th vote goes to the mayor. So now there are 3 African-American members of that city council, plus the Anglo mayor. And so we've still got 4 white votes to 3 black, if you want to be
But what
really
about
blunt about
voter
it.
turnout?
But voter turnout was higher than it's been before. Still was not huge, still not stellar, but higher than it's ever been before. So the community is clearly engaged. This is a 67% African-American community. It should have a majority of people who are part of that community on its city council, or at least people who are sympathetic to that voter constituency.
Kelly.
What I think is notable about it is the speed with which the original events, the protests, and now an electoral outcome. When you look at that, that's a very short span of time to show something that made the community rise up, demonstrations that were at times civil, at times less than civil, and then to have it result in people going to the polls, in people stepping forward and offering themselves to serve, and to see this change. To have that happen in a very narrow span of time, I hope will inspire people to be active in their communities even before events take place, to say, I'm willing to step forward and run, or I'm willing to support a candidate who
Indeed.
will.
It was a record turnout, which is 30%. So last time I think it was 12%, so it went up a little more than twice. That's still not stellar. One thing I found fascinating is once this new city council formulates and progresses, the first big order of business they face is a $3 million shortfall in revenues from the changes in the laws that they've made because of these things like we saw in South Carolina, which are routine traffic revenue stops.
Yeah.
Revenue measures that basically fall on the backs of certain residents in Ferguson. And so, you know, things have changed there, and they find, wow, here's this small community that has relied overly much on these kinds of fines and they're going to have to figure out how to fund themselves without those funds.
All right, Neil, and no surprises in the Boston verdict, but what happens now?
Well, now, no surprises, convicted on all counts. Now they go to basically the penalty phase, and whether or not he will face the death penalty. And, Elizabeth Warren, I think, has come out against it, the senator from Massachusetts, the Boston Globe. I mean, this is not a pro-death penalty state, needless to say. If I were to conjecture, I could guess that he might not actually go down that path, in part, even though it didn't work in the case. It wasn't him, it was his brother kind of thing. He is, after all, quite young, and obviously that might be a factor in determining what the penalty is.
But his lawyer can expand that whole argument. It was his brother in this kind of pleading in the second part of the case.
I made a reference earlier to Timothy McVeigh. I'll make one again because I covered that trial and that of Terry Nichols. McVeigh got the death penalty. Nichols did not. A jury determined that he was the lesser player and therefore came to a different result. Now, this jury is what they call death qualified, terrible term in the law. But what it means is in the voir dire, when they're assigning a jury, finding the jury, they determine that those jurors are willing to be open to using that as a ultimate punishment. So you do not have people sitting on the jury who are absolutely against it. But the community certainly reflects an attitude of being wary of the death penalty, not supporting the death penalty. I would not be surprised if he was given life and not the death penalty. But in this next phase, and Judy Clark, one of his lawyers, is preeminent in the law in trying to save convicted criminals from this fate. And she's very, very good at finding a way to humanize and to dissect the culpability and to try to get people to see a path where someone who they acknowledge the guilt, but they try to find a redeeming quality to save his life.
Apparently his attitude during the trial has not endeared him to those in the courtroom, Ron.
It's impossible to imagine how he could show enough remorse to really make a big difference, but there hasn't been that sense of seeking to have some degree of forgiveness that might have made a little bit of difference. But the other thing about a death penalty is that while it does give a sense of closure to some people, and we've had that kind of psychology discussed, there's also nothing else positive that can come from it. Whereas if he is incarcerated for the rest of his life, there could still be more information. There could still be more things that we learn from him, possibly in terms of contacts that he had, possibly in terms of what his motivations were. We might come to understand this act. There might be something more fruitful that could come from it.
I gather the defense needs to convince only one juror not to vote for the death penalty. Is that correct?
Yes. That's my understanding, yes.
And, the odds are you can find one sympathetic person in the state of Massachusetts, not sympathetic, of course, to the action, but sympathetic to the idea that the death penalty is not a solution.
What do you think's going to happen, Neil?
I would say that he will not have the death penalty imposed on him.
Do you all agree?
I'm not convinced, but I would lean toward that.
I'm just talking about the odds. 1 out of 12 is easier to do.
Yeah.
1 out of 12.
Than 12 out of 12.
Yeah, exactly. All right, let's talk about the White House immigration policy. A Texas judge refused to lift an injunction on President Obama's executive actions on immigration. What is this going to mean?
It's not a surprise. This is the judge, of course, who imposed this order in the first place. The Justice Department went back at him in the way that you're supposed to do, to ask for a stay, to ask for him to reconsider. But they didn't really expect him to change his mind. And as we can see from all he had to say this week, he ripped the government lawyers as misrepresenting the case and lying essentially in court. It was pretty tough stuff coming from the judge. So it was never likely, and they didn't get it. So now they're going to have to move on to the Circuit Court of Appeals, which more or less was expected all along. In that case, rather, that ruling from the Circuit Court of Appeals there in New Orleans will probably also come to the Supreme Court.
There was a ruling, I think it was this week, from that same appeals case on a contest. The states and some agents from border security were contesting the Dreamers executive decision that was made earlier than the one last year. And in that case, the appeals court basically threw out their case, their attempt to intervene, saying that they had no standing, which was read by a lot of people as a good sign for how the administration might fare in trying to win their appeal on this other case.
So we move on to another phase, but I thought it was interesting that the White House called for an end to conversion therapies for gay and transgender youth. Why do you think they came out now?
I think it actually was very simple explanation. The system, as I understand it, of the petitions, when people put in these petitions to the White House, once they get a certain level of support, and I think this had gotten something like 120,000.
100,000 is the threshold.
Yeah, once it crosses 100,000, the White House is actually obliged to say, all right, well, what do we make of this? And in this case, though it's been reported that it was the president that has now called for this ban on youth conversion therapy, it was actually Valerie Jarrett, one of his top aides, who wrote the letter, wrote the note, which is not a huge difference, but it's some difference. And, you know, they have no particular power over this. And at the moment, there are two states, California and New Jersey. And one thing that's interesting to note is one potential 2016 Republican candidate, Chris Christie, actually signed the law in New Jersey that was the ban of conversion therapy there, which is really fascinating because these kinds of legislation, which I think is alive now in 18 states, has had very difficult pathways in red states. Not that New Jersey is a red state, but it's not being embraced by conservatives. But how this ban would somehow or other become federal, or I think it's mainly the weight of the White House. Right? Its message, yeah.
But what happens then? I don't even understand what happens in conversion therapy. Tell us.
Well, from what I've read by people who have gone through it and then revealed it, it is a psychological treatment that suggests in many cases that there might have been childhood abuse and that a response to that abuse is homosexuality or a desire to change gender, and that somewhere rooted in the mind there is an answer, that if there can be a way to reach that, treat it, that you could unlock that and change the person's nature. People who have gone through that have said that it has been incredibly destructive, harmful, compounding, painful. Sometimes it's forced by parents who think they're doing the right thing. And it's very complicated. When you get family dynamics, when you get these sorts of issues, then there's a religious overlay in many cases. It is just fraught with problems. And so the medical community has said this is not appropriate. There's no efficacy to it. It is not proper. But it has taken place. And I think we're in a moment where not only are issues related to gay rights, gay marriage, getting a greater acceptance and a greater part of our national conversation, transgender has seemed to step forward now. There are different stories, different personal accounts, and this is another of those. And it is a rare situation. It is something many people are not familiar with, but for the White House to do this, it shines a very bright light and helps people to have the conversation and highlights the fact that this still occurs and that there are, in fact, states that are trying to deal with it. So it, I think, has a powerful impact there. For the White House, this is simple. They are on the side of issues that relate to the LGBT community. And so this is easy for them to do. And they saw that there was, through this online petition, a request, and it was easy to answer it and to bring that attention.
And the proposed law would be named for Leila Alcorn, a young woman who apparently committed suicide, having gone through this kind of treatment.
That's right. And it's another case of an egregious case, a tragic case, becoming the symbol for a much broader issue that affects many other people, perhaps not quite as severely. And in this instance, I mean, to put a little bit of a political overlay on it, and particularly the way that it was kind of brought to people's attention. Of course, it was prompted by this petition, which passed the threshold for a response, formal response from the White House. That's the formality of it. But there's also the political, if you will, impetus here, which is to say, let's keep this issue going. Let's have this conversation go on. We think this is a good conversation for the country to be having for its long-term sake, and also because we have an election coming in 2016, and this is an issue that's going to be brought forward, and we'd like to see where the various candidates stand on this.
And speaking of the 2016 election, we're told that Hillary Clinton is planning to announce on Sunday.
No, way. Wait.
Hillary Clinton?
She's running. No. Wait, did you say Hillary Clinton's running for president?
You mean the former
Is there a
president's wife,
bulletin?
Wait,
is that
Yes.
right?
Hillary Clinton. Oh, yeah, Hillary Clinton. Yeah. It's been a long drum roll, a long time coming. Of course, in some ways, she's sort of been running for president even before she ran the last time, which was in 2008. She's coming to this decision, or actually the announcement, in a very interesting way. We've seen this escalation in the last 2 weeks of announcements on the Republican side of these huge, splashy, choreographed kind of like shows, basically. I mean, Ted Cruz did his big thing. Rand Paul had multiple speakers and a kid singing the Star Spangled Banner and all these things being done. It's a real kind of arms race on the Republican side for who can do the splashiest announcement. She's announcing with a video, a tweet, and then she's going to go
to
probably
Iowa.
a few tweets, and then she's going to go on a kind of road trip through Iowa, keeping it small. She's going to probably have 3 or 4 times as many reporters at each event, and many of them outside, whatever the event is. Then there are going to be actual supporters on the inside of those events. So it's going to be an interesting week ahead.
And you're listening to the Diane Rehm Show. Why is she doing it this way?
I think because she is so well known, so trying to avoid the inevitable tag, which is impossible, that by going small, it counters some of that. The big question, though, is there is energy and life that comes from an announcement speech. I was at Ted Cruz and Rand Paul's announcement speeches. And when you're in the room and you're in the company of the people who chose to go and attend, so it's a group that wants to be there is a life to that. It's also sort of your organizing principle for why am I a candidate? Who am I? Why do I offer myself to the country? That's a big, big, big moment. And she's choosing not to take it in that traditional way, as she did back in 2007, 2008 as well. The big speed is not her greatest strength, really. She is better in a smaller venue. So I think by rolling out in a smaller venue, she's trying to lower expectations. If you do it in a video message that's posted online, you have complete control over the performance of that. And I can see that she is wanting to have that be perfect.
So what does she need to do right off the bat, Ron?
She needs to talk about the ideas that she has that will help people in their own lives. She needs to get away from being something of an imperial figure in the imperial city, somebody who has been in power in one sense or another, Secretary of State, United States Senator, First Lady, for a very long time, 20 years more. And she needs to get down a little bit into the ordinary sphere of the way people actually live, talk about how she's in favor of lessening income inequality and how she might actually get there. Talk about paid leave for families so that not only would jobs be guaranteed as they've been by the Family and Medical Leave Act that her husband signed, but actually paid so that people who don't make a lot of money or have a lot of money can take advantage of it. Real stuff people can actually relate to.
And isn't there some conflict with Marco Rubio's planned announcement?
Well, I'm heading to Miami to cover that, and he will announce Monday from a location that's important to Cuban Americans in Miami, where they were processed. They're Ellis Island, if you will. And we're at that point now where the dance card is pretty full. It's hard to select a date that doesn't have conflict with other known events. For Marco Rubio, he's going to come back to Washington and be on his job at the Senate, so there was a limited window for him. And I don't think Hillary Clinton in any way intends to overshadow him. It will have that effect to some degree. And you have to pick a date. And once she gets in, she's going to take a lot of oxygen.
And Bill Clinton's role?
Well, he said, I'm sure he may be referring to an interview that he gave recently to Town and Country, where he was talking that for at least the time being, and probably well into the campaign, perhaps well into next year, he will be a backstage advisor. Bill Clinton has never been known for being backstage at anything. He's very much front stage. He can be extraordinary when he does go step to the front of the stage.
Will he be helpful?
Yes, he will be helpful if he's used at the right moments, as he was for Obama, obviously in the 2012 convention when he gave what was probably the best speech of that year. He can also be a problem. He can, as he proved to be for Hillary Clinton in 2007, 2008, saying things that are a little off, getting testy. You know, the one thing that he said in that interview also was, I'm not sure I'm really cut out for this anymore because I'm not mad at anybody, something like that. That he sort of lost his his campaign mojo in that way.
That would be good, actually, to lose that particular mojo. But he did that interview with Town and Country because Horse and Hound was not available.
Ron Elving of NPR, Kelly O'Donnell of NBC, Neil King Jr. of the Wall Street Journal. When we come back, we'll talk about some of the other candidates out there and take your calls. Stay with us. Sabrina, you're on the air.
Hi, Diane. Thanks so much for taking my call.
Of course.
Good morning, panelists.
Good
morning.
Hi. So my comment was, imagine if the entire incident with Mike Brown had been videotaped, like this incident with Walter Scott in North Carolina. Things would probably have turned out a little different. However, I and a lot of people that I talk to have become so disillusioned with the justice system since the Tamir race and the Eric Garner and the young man that was in the Walmart. Those police officers were able to get off, and there was videotape of exactly what happened in those instances too. So my question to the panelists is, what should I tell my son who is 9 years old with 153 IQ? Should I lock him in the basement? Because I don't see any of the candidates who have announced saying anything about what the plan is, including Hillary Clinton. And I love Hillary Clinton. But right now, I don't feel like I should support any of them because that's the issue that concerns me the most.
I understand full well. Neil King, what should she tell her son?
I think she should tell him to be extremely cautious around police, stay away from them if possible, and to hope for change from all of this. I mean, I think what we have seen is extraordinary and is egregious. I think, well, I hope as much as I think that this videotape out of South Carolina will be one of these things that changes matters. I think the thing that most needs to happen is there needs to be consequence to the police officers in particular. There has been a real reluctance, in part for good reasons. I mean, police officers face a miserable fate if they should end up in prison. But on the other hand, there needs to be real consequences for these kinds of acts.
Let's turn to another point of view from Thomas in Tallahassee, Florida. You're on the air.
Yeah, there are two issues with the South Carolina shooting. Number one, there's already an existing fear of the police among African Americans. I'm an older black man over 50 who has a clean police record, but I have been stopped and even handcuffed for routine traffic stops. I teach my kids daily, especially my son, on how to respond if he's stopped, but that still doesn't eliminate the frustration. See, this South Carolina event is nothing new. His name is Walter Scott, but for me, his name is Clifford Glover, 10 years old, one of my neighbors who was shot in the back years ago in New York City, Clifford Glover. Second thing is, I've read that the victim of the shooting in South Carolina was afraid of being arrested for owing child support. I used to work for my state's child support agency, and I believe in personal responsibility. But I have personally seen fear in others of being arrested for owing child support, even to the point of wanting to commit suicide. Now, whether we like to admit it or not, we're stacking the deck against poor people, much like did I guess Victorian England and South African apartheid and Jim Crow in America. Debtors' prisons, laws on excessive economic, situations that restrict a person from digging themselves out, even if they want to. I mean, this needs to be addressed on many different levels, not just, there's a shooting and let's arrest the officer, whatever.
Thank you. Kelly?
Well, it's important to point out that Walter Scott had no criminal record, had never been accused of doing anything violent or improper. Child support was apparently an issue. That's a financial issue. We don't know a lot of the details there. He had served in the U.S. Coast Guard. Fear is a powerful thing. Fear that must have been in the mind of Walter Scott, perhaps fear in the mind of the officer. It causes people to do things that in the calm light of day they would not otherwise do. And I think that's part of what played into this event. And I'm just really, really absorbed in the notion of what was he thinking, meaning Mr. Scott, why did he run? What was he hoping to accomplish? Because in those moments of fear, you're not necessarily evaluating the facts in front of you. And did that put him in much greater peril? What was the officer thinking? Why did he not just simply let him run away? If he had possession of his license, which I think the video indicates, he knew who he was. Why go after him? And if there had been and there was not some warrant or something, you have identification. There would have been other steps to take. That's what's so confounding about this.
To Norman, Oklahoma. Hushang, you're on the air.
Hi, Diane. Hi, panelists.
Hello.
I am calling regarding the Tsarnaev bombing case. I came to the United States 36 years ago from Iran when I was 18. And I had been wanting to come to the United States since I was 11 years old. But when I came here as an aftermath of the hostage crisis and everything else, for a year or two, I had a really, 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 really hard time wanting to stay here. And this young man who's done these unspeakable crimes, I can see myself being in that age and being so confused. And you were just speaking of fear, being so fearful now that I don't want to take too much time. I think we should give this guy a chance. Maybe we won't be doing the same thing that these criminals are doing, giving him a chance to be remorseful. He will be, because I know I went through it when I was 19, 20 years old.
Thank you. Neil.
I'm not an expert on this case, but I'm not sure that there was necessarily big evidence, if you go back over the last few years and look at the brothers, that they were marginalized in some important way or isolated or picked on in their schools or anything. It's the thing that was shocking to a lot of people is that they had rather swiftly Americanized. They were like hanging out and smoking pot and just guys.
Friends and athletic.
Got
and
the music, everything else.
Yeah.
Don't know. Let's go to Adam in Annapolis, Maryland. You're on the air.
Hi, Dan. Thanks for taking my call.
Sure.
I just had a comment in regards to the death penalty in the Tsarnaev case. My perspective was changed a little bit in the DC sniper case. I'm originally from Chesapeake, Virginia, where I believe the case was being held. But my father told me, gave me a perspective on that, where he was very dubious on the use of the death penalty in the son, mainly because of how influence a father or parental figure can have on the lifestyle of a son. So I think some people should take that into account in this case specifically.
And I think surely that's
good
exactly
example.
what his lawyer will
That's
say.
right. And
Lee
the
Malvo
parallels,
got life, and
that's
Muhammad
right.
was
The
given
parallels are not exact. The parallels are not perfect. But clearly, you had a case of one personality dominating another in the Sniper case. And obviously, for those of us who live here in this metropolitan area, that remains a keen memory. And I think that part of the
Was
parallel
that
to the way that
a
people feel
scary
in Boston,
time? Yeah.
that was a terrifying time for
Yeah.
everyone. So I do think that part of the parallel, and then of course the influence of the older personality on the younger, should give some people some pause.
All right.
As it did in that matter.
I want to take us back to politics for a few moments. Ted Cruz has a super PAC, Neil, that has raised a lot of money.
Actually, he has 4 super PACs that all have basically the same name, and they claim, we don't know this for sure, we're not going to have the actual data until the summer, to have raised $31 million this week. Now, we talk about eye-popping or beyond belief.
Yeah,
this
how
is beyond
unusual
belief.
is
So
that?
a little perspective. Mitt Romney, in all of the first half of 2011, just his campaign, his own campaign, and his super PAC, and he was the dominant money-raising force in that cycle by far on the Republican side, raised a little bit more than that in the first 6 months of 2011. What Ted Cruz did, and what we don't know is this 4 people? I mean, what we're looking at is a totally transformed electoral landscape where 2 or 3 people can put up unlimited amounts of money for what might be marginal candidates and totally give them life. I mean, if you look at Rick Santorum, who came in second in 2012 on the Republican side, he personally, in his own campaign, raised like a matter of a few millions in the entire year of 2011. I mean, he was living on fumes the whole time. This is transformation.
So it's got to be a wake-up call for the rest of the field.
Yes, and it's also a response to people saying Jeb Bush was going to raise something like $100 million in the first 6 months of the year, and that was going to blow everybody else away. And Ted Cruz is saying, it's not going to blow me away. I'm doing just fine. Thank you very much. But I think the point that Neil makes that is very interesting is he has 4 super PACs. Why does he have 4 super PACs? I suspect there are some differences here in terms of disclosure, that some of these super PACs you can give to if you want to have your name get out, and there may be one in there where you don't have to have your name get out.
Is this all
And the amounts
because
can change.
Citizens United?
Well, certainly that changed the landscape of how this is done. I think where Ted Cruz is concerned, and I cover him in the Senate, and I've been out on the trail with him, there is a clarity about his message that is well delivered. He's polished in his delivery, and he breaks through in what is still a very crowded GOP field for those voters. He's from Texas, which is always, the finance capital for people wanting to raise money. And he has worked at this very steadily for a long time. He's a bright man who had a very clear plan of how he was going to do this, and he is executing that plan.
What about Rand Paul?
I was in Kentucky. Rand Paul delivered his announcement. I think what he is doing that is quite different from the other Republicans is he is trying to be a conservative who is mindful in a public way about the limitations of the party as it is today, wanting to talk to minority communities, wanting to go to places where Republicans don't always go. Now, that doesn't mean that will translate to votes, but he is trying to have a real dialogue there. He's talking about things like prison sentencing reform that resonates in certain communities. He's also trying to reach young people by talking about NSA spying and government intrusion. Those are things that are not typical topics. Now, for the broader sweep of the Republican Party, his foreign policy views are really at odds. He's, I think, modified in some ways. But what's also interesting about Rand Paul is his personality. He is a pugnacious man.
Prickly.
Yes, there is a prickly quality to him. And I think watching lots of candidates over time, that is perilous, because if people do not feel at ease, I've covered him a lot, And I still get that sense from him of a prickliness. Most of the people I interact with, you have a professional collegiality, and that is helpful to a candidate. So his prickliness will be viewed by some as being a fighter. That's a good thing. And by others, it will be viewed as not quite the right temperament.
That's funny because the times I've been with him personally in sort of smaller settings, I actually have found him to be fairly jovial and fairly warm. But of course, that doesn't matter. It's how you come across in a bigger setting. And I'm a big believer that temperament is like the main thing to start, that people vote on candidates because they're warm or they're optimistic or they're uplifting. And the thing that I found fascinating about his debut is if you think of, Barack Obama, things like change you can believe in, or the kind of, what is their slogan? His slogan is defeat the Washington machine. I mean, for the first word in your slogan to be defeat is pretty defeatist, right? It's not exactly an uplifting message. So I kind of wonder whether he's going to need to recraft. I don't think people are going to go, yeah, let's defeat the Washington machine. It's very hard. You have to run on hope.
Part of it. He's part of
His
it.
title is senator.
Exactly. What is it about Wisconsin Governor Scott Walker that's getting under the president's skin, Ron Elving?
Well, one thing we have to say about Scott Walker is he's not a senator. He's a governor. He comes from Wisconsin. He has almost no Washington taint whatsoever. And that's a big advantage for him in this large field of people, many of whom come from Washington or have names like Bush, which are associated with Washington. What gets under, I think, Obama's skin is a lot of Democrats just don't feel like Scott Walker they shouldn't be paying any attention to them. They just don't see him in the proper weight class. Now, here again, he's not from Washington. He hasn't been part of the foreign policy discussion, the national security discussion, all the things that they think a president needs to have heft, or a candidate needs to have heft. He comes across as kind of a boondocks guy who, might have had a couple of good lucky goes in Wisconsin. Of course, he's won an awful lot of elections. He's been on the ballot almost every 2 years in Wisconsin for 20 years for the legislature and for various and sundry offices, but they just don't respect him. So when he gets off his zinger at the president, it gets under the president's skin.
And you're listening to the Diane Rehm Show. Rahm Emanuel has won a second term as mayor of Chicago. Did that election change him in any way?
I don't to speculate on the forces that will change Rahm Emanuel is a treacherous thing to do. I think so. In some ways, it might have humbled him a little bit. Make him more sensitive to the very, very diverse interest groups and clashing interest groups in Chicago. It certainly honed his political skills a great deal, and those of his operation. They got out a lot more votes in a runoff than they did the first time around. What really won it for him was that a lot more voters from white districts anyway came out. It became a kind of clash in a way between African American and Hispanic voters in Chicago. He managed to maintain evidently about the same support among Hispanics from what we can tell from the numbers, which is pretty unusual. The big question now seems to be, okay, is Rahm going to try to become a multi-term mayor like the Dailies did? Or will he give it one more try and then see whether he can use that as a launch pad to something else? And that kind of frightens people in Chicago because they don't want to be his launch pad, because being his launch pad might not necessarily be great for at least some of the residents of Chicago.
All right. And the last person I want to ask you about is Bob Schieffer, one of my favorite journalists in the whole wide world.
Absolutely.
Meaning no disrespect, but he has just been such a strong, staunch believer in getting to what the news is. We're going to miss him when he retires.
I'm certainly going to miss him. I was one who many years ago felt it would have been nice to see him take over for Walter Cronkite instead of Dan Rather. No disrespect to Dan Rather necessarily, but just Bob had just a completely different way of delivering the news. And it was, to my way of thinking, more attractive and also just a little bit more the kind of relationship you had with Uncle Walter when Cronkite was giving you the news, and some of the other people of that generation. Schieffer carried that on a little better. I think Dan Rather was younger. He was more dynamic. He was more mediagenic, perhaps. And therefore, of course, history took that turn. But I'm going to miss Bob Schieffer for sure.
I will always appreciate that Bob Schieffer can deliver a question with a smile, respectfully, and it is a simple question that gets to the heart of the matter and often generates news. I think that is something to emulate, and it's something I enjoy watching as a viewer, simply in my viewerness, not only as a journalist. And when I first came to Washington as a young journalist, he was incredibly kind to me, and I respected and appreciated that so much.
He is and was classy, kind, very much an exemplar of a slightly different generation of journalists. I'm not saying we're not all classy and kind, but he was very much representative of that generation. I'll be sad to see him leave the state.
Well done, Bob.
Absolutely. I'll hope to have him on before he leaves that chair. Thank you all. Happy Friday.
Happy Friday.
Have
Thank
a
you,
good weekend.
Thank you, Diane.
And thanks for listening all. I'm Diane Rehm.
The Diane Rehm Show is produced by Sam Inkert, Denise Couture,